Okay, last segment we were discussing Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and the time period brought us up until about 1980. So I want to resume our discussion from that point onward. On September 22nd, 1980, Saddam really delivers a shock not only to the region but to the world by taking advantage of the political chaos that was characterizing the revolutionary Iran and the upheavals Iran was experimenting, and therefore he invades Iran. And thus begins the Iran-Iraq war, which lasts from 1980 until 1988. What were really Saddam's motivation for invading Iran? Was he really reacting, as some have argued, to a sense of threat from the rise of political Islam in Iran, given that the majority of the Iraqi population are Shiites, and this was a Shiite-led revolution? So that's one kind of explanation for Saddam's motivation. The other one is, did he really see a tremendous opportunity in the revolutionary chaos that followed after the fall of the Shah and the success of the revolution? So it's been debated among scholars what was his real motivation. I think if you look at Saddam's record, there's no question that this man was a rank opportunist. He really, I believe, reacted out of a sense of unique opportunity that was afforded to him by the chaos in Iran, and he decided to take Iran on. In fact, if you look at Saddam's speeches regarding the revolution in Iran and also the speeches by his lieutenants, they were very dismissive of political Islam and the Islamic resurgence movement when it appeared to Iran. He was very contemptuous of the Iranian leadership, and he viewed them as totally lacking in competence. In other words, you're not going to take a country 3 times your size, that's Iran's relative to Iraq, just simply out of fear. You only do it if you see that country deeply vulnerable. And Iran had become deeply vulnerable at that time. So, and remember, Iran had the American hostages. Most of Iran's weapons came from the United States. And there was going to be no way Iran was going to get spare parts it needed. Iran, in June of 1980, had executed close to half of the American trained pilots because of them being implicated in a coup attempt. So Iran was a sitting duck as far as Saddam was concerned. And remember, Saddam is in a rivalry with Assad of Syria. He saw this as a wonderful opportunity. If he could defeat this highly vulnerable regime in Iran and take over the oil-producing provinces, the western provinces of Iran, and make that part of Iraq, his popularity among the Arabs will rise up, and his policy would marginalize Assad of Syria. So he just saw this as a wonderful opportunity. So what happened was, after rapid initial advances of the Iraqi armies into the Iranian territories, Iraqi army gets bogged down, and the war soon begins to turn into a stalemate. As the war drags on much longer than had been anticipated by Saddam, we begin to see that Iran is able to slowly recover, and being much larger in terms of population than Iraq and having a lot of resources, although disorganized, it begins to organize a counterattack, and it begins to really drain Iraq's resources. And to continue fighting, Saddam is forced to bring into Iraq close to 1.5 million Egyptians. These Egyptians really end up taking over the jobs of the Shiites who are now conscript and serving in the army. Meanwhile, after a few years into the war, with no end in sight, the domestic situation in Iraq begins to, in some way, to resemble the situation in Iran. Both countries, because of the war, had become highly polarized during the war, but there was a difference between Iran and Iraq. Excuse me. In the case of Iraq, the pole that was fighting comprised mostly of Shia conscripts who hated the Sunni-led regime of Saddam. In the case of Iran, however, the pole that was fighting supported the government, and they were willing to see this as a martyrdom for the cause of Islam. Therefore, in the case of Iraq, we really had the problem of low morale on the part of mostly Shiite conscripts who were doing the fighting. Well, to make a long story short, finally in August 20th, 1988, just a month shy of 8 years, through the United Nations mediation, the war between Iran and Iraq comes to an end. Iran and Iraq war actually is considered the longest conventional war fought in the 20th century. And in some ways, it very much is reminiscent of the trench warfare of the World War I genre. And as with World War I, Saddam used chemical weapons against both the Iranian soldiers and also, especially for his restive Kurdish subjects, a topic that I mentioned in our earlier lecture. All in all, the casualty for the war really approached 1 million dead and injured for both Iranian and Iraqi side. And the best estimate we have thus far is somewhere about 350,000 killed and twice as many wounded on both sides. Now, I want to kind of digress briefly to point out the significance of the Iran-Iraq war in that it really reveals a lot about the state of international politics. Throughout this course, if you recall, I have said that you are going to learn a lot about the nature of the Cold War conflict if you study how that conflict was actually fought out in one of the most important strategic regions of the Cold War, the Middle East. I should say the Middle East remains a strategic region because of its oil, and not just during the Cold War, but it was certainly that particularly during the Cold War. Now, a famous and well-known historian by the name of John Gaddis, whose specialty is the history of the field of international relations, famously criticized international relations theories for having failed to predict the end of the Cold War. Now, whether this is a fair criticism or not, answering him will take us too far afield. However, I want to challenge him by noting that if you look at the actual behaviors of the two superpowers during the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988, especially the latter part of that conflict, particularly from 1987 to 1988, you can see how the Cold War functionally, that is in effect, although not officially, had already reached its end. Actually, when you think about it, there is no official end date for the Cold War. Most observers, however, regard the disintegration of the former Soviet Union as bringing to an end the Cold War. This, of course, occurred at the end of December of 1991. But 3 years earlier, back in 1988, as the Iran-Iraq War was reaching its end, we have good evidence that indicates that the Cold War had effectively come to an end. How? Well, the best way to understand the ending of that war is to look at how the so-called Holy Trinity of United States interest had changed. So by examining changes in the Holy Trinity, we have an excellent clue as to the functional end of the Cold War as early as at 1988, when Iran-Iraq War had ended. So let us briefly review the Holy Trinity that we talked about. That Holy Trinity was a Cold War construct. So look at the period from 1958 to 1988. We still have the Cold War. And as a Cold War construct, it really encapsulated the United States' main interest in the Middle East region. So the question is, if the Cold War was no longer driving force and giving definition to the superpower conflict, then it means that the conflict had functionally reached its end. And therefore, even though it had officially not ended, it had functionally come to an end. So let us re-examine this Holy Trinity in that period. Remember, the first and the most important, this is what Cold War was all about, was containing this expansion of Soviet Union influence in the Middle East. That was our first part of the interest, of the three interests. The second one was to ensure free flow of oil at reasonable prices to the West. And lastly, to ensure the security of the state of Israel. Again, recall from the earlier segment that when we talked about these three interests, the question was, what was the means that we're going to use to accomplish these ends? In other words, what means we were going to rely upon to be able to achieve these three ends? And the answer to that question from the earlier lecture was simply that an alliance with conservative autocratic regimes in the Arab world, mostly monarchies, would allow us to satisfy these three ends. So the means for achieving the three ends were the alliance with these regimes. Now, the alliance with these regimes would work for us because they were anti-communist. They wanted to ensure free flow of oil to the West. And their enmity toward Israel was mostly at the rhetorical level. They, like Israel, feel the forces of political change and Arab nationalism as much as Israel dreaded the rise of Arab nationalism. So in a sense, they had a commonality of interest with Israel, these regimes did. So the alliance with these conservative regimes allow us to accomplish these three ends. So this is what the Cold War situation is. So now let's see how after 1988 the Holy Trinity changed. In other words, after the end of Iran-Iraq War, how did the Holy Trinity change? So now we're getting a revised or new Holy Trinity after 1988. The first, of course, is now to ensure the free flow of oil at reasonable prices. That has now, by 1988, become our first and primary interest. The second one is ensuring the security of the state of Israel. And now the third one is, that used to be just a means for accomplishing the original three ends, is to protect conservative autocratic Arab regimes against external and internal threats. So the question now is, what had changed from the Cold War period? And the answer is, containment of Soviet Union was no longer the primary interest. Where is the evidence for that? Well, actually, the Iran-Iraq War provides superb evidence for that. Around 1987, what happened was that Iraq, being desperate, they started to bomb Iranian tankers carrying Iranian oil. Iraq itself couldn't sell oil because Iran had bombed its port, so Iraqi oil was being sold through Kuwaiti tankers. But the Kuwaitis were helping Iraq to sell its oil in order to have cash. Little did Kuwaitis know that soon they're going to get invaded by Saddam. But in the meantime, this is what they were doing. Iran, therefore, kept asking the international community that oil flow should not be interrupted and that they should do whatever they can not to allow Saddam to bomb Iranian tankers. And when the international community didn't react, Iran decided to retaliate. So for every Iranian tanker that was getting attacked by the Iraqi airplane, Iran was attacking maybe every fifth or sixth Kuwaiti tankers. At one point, the Kuwaitis got really upset, so they came to the United States and they asked the Reagan administration if they're willing to provide United States Navy to escort their tankers so that they will not get attacked by Iran. The Reagan administration actually said, no, we don't want to get involved in that war. So the Kuwaitis went and asked the Soviet Union, asked Mikhail Gorbachev if the Soviet Navy is willing to escort Kuwaiti tankers. And so the Soviets said, yes, we will be happy to do that. So now suddenly you have Soviet Union coming into the Persian Gulf, and immediately the Reagan administration changed its mind. And the bizarre situation is that you got the Soviet Navy and the American Navy escorting Kuwaiti tankers. So what happened to the Cold War? These two superpowers are both helping the Kuwaitis tanker. So this is known as the Tanker War, and it occurred towards the end of Iran-Iraq War. So that episode, you will see from that point onward, the Cold War had functionally ended. The whole idea of containing the Soviet Union was not to allow their naval forces to enter the warm water of Persian Gulf. And yet, by the end of the Iran-Iraq War, that is exactly what had happened. And in the meantime, we are trying to patch our differences with Gorbachev. Remember, when Gorbachev came to power, Margaret Thatcher of Britain called him a man we can do business with. A very strange terminology for communists to be described that way. So anyway, at the end of that period, oil interest had moved on to the primary position, with both Soviet Union and United States ensuring the free flow of oil. Israel's security had moved up to the second position, so that was the natural fact. And what had happened was, in the third place was now the protection of the conservative authoritarian Arab regime. In other words, what used to be our policy means had crept into a position of a policy end. So the policy means over time had evolved into a policy end, and this is a phenomena that I call, or some other analysts have referred to as policy drift. By policy drift, we're talking about behaving differently from the official script, from the official definition of the situation that had prevailed during the Cold War. Remember, official definition would say you got to contain the Soviet influence in the region. By the end of Iran-Iraq war, the Soviet Navy was escorting with the United States together jointly the Kuwaiti tankers. So even though officially you're pretending as if nothing had changed and the Cold War is still waging, in reality you're no longer fighting that battle. So the drift in policy precipitated by the parting of actual behavior from the official policy creates a political space that is then filled with a new end. That new end happens to be the old means to satisfying the Holy Trinity. So the new end is the protection of these conservative regimes. But the question still remains, how did this come about? What had made the means of our policy, that is support for conservative Arab regime, to transform into an end? For answer to that question, we need to go back a little bit in time. Remember, once we really began to get heavily involved in the Middle East circa late 1950s, for over 3 decades we were steadily developing very complex network of relationship, and both commercial, I should say, and military and security relationship with these very wealthy oil monarchies in the Gulf, and we were very closely cooperating with them. By the 1980s, these relationships had evolved into a powerful set of vested interests in commercial and military areas. So we had developed these vested interests, and our stakes were getting to be very, very high with these regimes, and stakes were so high that it necessitated ensuring the survival of these regimes in order to protect our commercial and military interest. Incredible amount of military equipments were being sold to these regimes. Most of them didn't even know how to use it, or didn't even have the capability for using it. So now you have a situation in the Persian Gulf that these monarchies are now beginning to really feel a threat. Now, these monarchies really had no love for Saddam Hussein. They viewed him as a kind of a dangerous person, but they feared the rise of political Islam, especially as it was being championed in Iran, their neighbor, and they worried much more about the fear from Islam than they did about Saddam. So this is what they feared the most, the rise of Islam, because that would trigger a mass uprising in their own country. So during the Iran-Iraq war, when it appeared to them that Saddam would not win this conflict and could possibly lose, these monarchies began to pressure the United States to help Iraq. So given our ties and our very intricately interwoven interest with these regimes, we decided that we need to take their concerns and interest into consideration. And this really explains why during the Iran-Iraq war we ended up tilting toward Iraq in order to prevent Saddam's defeat by Iran. So that's the explanation why these monarchies who served as a means to satisfying the Holy Trinity in the post-Cold War era will become an end for the United States.